get started now. So thank you guys for coming. So the topic of this panel discussion is animal research in neuroscience, past, present, and future. And so I'm just going to briefly introduce all of the speakers here first. Then I'll go into the prompts, and then we'll have 8-minute presentations by each speaker, followed by a cross-panel discussion. And the last half hour is going to be reserved for audience questions. So feel free to tweet at the ScAAN account, so that's @ScientistAction. If you don't want to say your question out loud, we're usually going to be monitoring that and he'll speak it for you. Or if you're remote, that's another way you can get your question in. Otherwise, you can just raise your hand and we'll have that. Okay, so Mark Klinger is, want to raise your hand? Mark Klinger here is one of the 6 veterinarians on the Washington Square campus. So he takes care of, or helps take care of, the 64 macaques and thousands of rodents used by neuroscience researchers at NYU. And he's an expert in the unique challenges associated with healthcare for animals used in experiments, including the nutritional, environmental, and enrichment requirements, as well as disease management. Tony Mogshan is a professor of neuroscience. He studies the development and function of the visual system, primarily through reporting of single neuron activity in the visual cortex of the macaque-monkey brain. His research asks how neural activity is related to perception and behavior, and he also studies how abnormal visual experiences during early life affect the development of the visual system by studying disorders like amblyopia. Carolyn Newhouse, third speaker, is a research scholar and bioethicist, and her research at the Hastings Center. Her research ranges from the philosophical foundations of the use of animals in biomedical research to the use of AI in healthcare. And she's previously sat on NYU Langone's Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, IACUC, which is the institutional body that oversees the ethical use and care of lab animals. And to my left right here, we have Jeff Sebo. He's a clinical assistant professor of environmental studies. He is a biomedical ethicist and philosopher, and his research is focused on bioethics, animal ethics, and environmental ethics. He's co-authored 2 books, including Chimpanzee Rights and Food, Animals, and the Environment. So before we get started with the quick 8-minute remarks, just as a reminder, I'm going to go like this when you have 30 seconds left, and like this when you have 50 seconds left. So I'll first read this prompt, and then we'll get started. I think the order that we're going to go with is Mark, Mark, Jeff, Tony, and Carolyn. So over the last few decades, experimentation on animals such as rodents and non-human primates have allowed neuroscientists to make enormous progress on our basic understanding of the human brain. And many of these findings contribute to either basic scientific knowledge or clinical treatments for neurological disease. And to many experimentalists, the harms done to animals are justified by virtue of their benefits, be they clinical treatment or the production of basic knowledge as an end in itself. In practice, research ethics boards, such as IACUCs, adjudicate whether the benefits are likely to outweigh the harms on an experiment-by-experiment basis. But their deliberations are largely opaque to non-scientists. So in this public forum, I invite each of you to comment on the following 3 questions. Firstly, how has the approach to regulating animal experimentation in neuroscience evolved throughout history? Secondly, how are such experiments regulated now? And thirdly, and most importantly, what is your vision for the best possible future for this field? So no further ado, we'll start with Mark.
Thank you, and I want to thank Jennifer and ScAAN for putting this together. This is a great opportunity. There's been scientists and animal research has been kind of in the shadows as scientists have been trying to do their work and really are kind of been shy to really promote what it is they do, why they do it, and their dedication to making life better for both humans and animals and society. And I look forward to more of these interactions and dialogues as we go through, because transparency is really incredibly important. So I've been doing this, so what am I? I'm a veterinarian, but I'm a board certified veterinarian in laboratory animal medicine. It's a recognized specialty of the American Veterinary Medical Association. I've been doing this for about 30 years now. And bioethics is part of that specialty. And what really piqued my interest is, I don't know if any of you here remember Henry Spira. I remember watching him speak at the New School back in the early 90s, and that really piqued my interest. There was a whole big conference on use of animals in research, and really the idea is, what are we? What are humans? What is our relationship to animals? It's a relationship that has evolved over time. The animals that we bring into our sphere of consideration, as opposed to those animals out in the wild, is, we have to take care of our biosphere. It's a consideration of the whole as opposed to being myopic. And we'll get into some more of those discussions later. And I think that my understanding of things is that over time, things have been progressing. Society has become more humane, ethical, and the concept of experimentation with animals and humans have evolved with considerations of what is pain, what is suffering, and awareness of who we are, and awareness of what animals are and our relationship to them. And over the course of my time, I've seen amazing developments and improvements in health. When I first started, we didn't even know what immunology was. Now we have an incredibly good understanding of it. There's a lot more to go, but advances that have made life much better for both animals and people. And so we want to continue to use animals in the most ethical and humane way possible. And science has been that tool that enables us to understand what it is that makes us human and what it is that makes animals and their relationship to us. And so I look forward to this discussion, and we'll see where it goes.
Didn't even use 2 minutes, it's perfect.
Is that 8 minutes, or how was that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, first of all, I want to echo thanking you for organizing this event and thanking everybody for being here. I think this is really, really wonderful, in particular having an event with supporters and critics of certain types of animal research is a very rare thing. Normally, we all get into our little epistemic bubbles and we preach to the choir and we develop these simplistic and reductive caricatures about each other, and that, of course, is not the way we arrive at mutual understanding about an extraordinarily morally and scientifically complex issue. So even if we disagree, we might disagree, I really do appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation, and I hope that we can have more of these types of conversation across animal studies and animal research and animal law and so on. So with that said, what I want to do with my time is focus on application of harm-benefit analysis as a justification for certain types of harmful, invasive, non-human subjects research. As Jen said in the introduction, we often do, in our justifications of certain types of non-human subjects research, invoke a risk-benefit or cost-benefit or harm-benefit principle. We say, this type of research is going to cause particular types of harms to this finite number of non-human animals, but in exchange, it holds the promise of having these great, along with other scientific research, of course, great benefits for human and non-human populations, and the potential for these benefits outweighs these particular harms that we know it will cause. Now, in general, I want to be clear, I am a fan of harm-benefit analysis. I am a consequentialist and a pragmatist. I think we should live in a way that does the most good possible, that maximizes expected benefit over expected harm, so I endorse the method. However, I think that the way that we apply harm-benefit analysis in the context of non-human subjects research is often much narrower than the way that we apply harm-benefit analysis in other contexts, for example, the context of human subjects research. And so what I want to do is explore what it would look like if we were to apply harm-benefit analysis in the same kind of way, and I want to suggest that that would make it harder to justify certain forms of harmful, invasive, non-consensual, non-therapeutic, non-human subjects research. So, as I said before, I think we normally apply harm-benefit analysis by comparing the direct individual harms to the non-human subjects of research with the indirect structural benefits of future human and non-human animals if this study does indeed lead to some kind of scientific or medical breakthrough that can help us in the future. I already think that that math is a little bit suspicious, and in the human subject's case, we would ordinarily be reluctant to cause profound harm to particular vulnerable human subjects because of the potential for some distant possible benefit, but set that aside for the time being. I think that there are certain types of harms and certain types of considerations that are often left out of this discussion. So first of all, I think there are certain types of harms that are often left out of this discussion. Not always. I think some people, including some people here, do consider them, but often. So first of all, there are harms to humans that are often left out of the harm-benefit analysis. And these include especially false positives and false negatives, both therapeutic false positives and false negatives, and toxicity false positives and false negatives, because of course, non-human subjects are not excellent predictors of human health and well-being. Now, I do think people do sometimes consider these considerations, but not often enough, in my view. But more generally, I think that there are a lot of harms to non-human animals that are left out of the equation. This includes things that go beyond pain and suffering. So for example, a broad range of emotional harms are often not perceived or not considered as much as they should be. Also, deprivation of positive mental and emotional states are often not considered as much as they should be. So deprivation for opportunities for pleasure and happiness, and the type of pleasure and happiness that you could get with extended life are often left out of the equation. Moreover, there are indirect harms to non-human animals, indirect and structural harms to non-human animals that are often left out of the equation. Often, when we use a vulnerable population in this kind of way, not only does it cause direct harm to the particular members of that vulnerable population who we use, but it also causes indirect harms because it contributes to social perceptions of this population as objects or property or commodities that are available for our domination and exploitation and oppression. And when we contribute to those social perspectives, then it makes possible certain further harms. In the case of non-human animals, harms in food and entertainment, and harms to animals in the wild, and so on. And so if we are considering both the direct harms and benefits and the indirect structural benefits for humans of animal research, we should also consider the full range of direct and indirect harms to human and non-human animals, at which point I think that there are more considerations on the negative side than we sometimes appreciate. Another consideration which is often left out of this discussion is consideration of counterfactuals. In other words, what might have been had we used this time and energy and these resources on alternative forms of research. So if you want to show that a particular kind of research, for example, harmful invasive non-human subjects research, does good things and has benefits, then you need to do more than show that it led to good outcomes. You also need to give us some reason to believe that alternative forms of research would not have led to those good outcomes. Similarly, prospectively, you need to do more than show that it holds the promise to lead to future good outcomes. You need to show that other forms of research, if we were to invest in them now, would not similarly lead to certain types of good outcomes. It would only be then that you could show that this particular type of research, in spite of its costs, offers the promise for these unique benefits, which are so substantial that they outweigh the costs. Both the full range of harms and benefits and the relevant counterfactuals are left out of most harm-benefit analyses that are deployed in order to justify non-human subjects research. Now, there is good reason for that. If we were to do a fully rigorous and systematic and holistic cost-benefit or harm-benefit analysis, we would never really be able to finish the conversation. This is extraordinarily difficult to do. We lack the time and energy and information necessary to consider all of the direct and indirect costs and benefits for human and non-human animals that might result from this research, together with, of course, the counterfactuals, which are very difficult to imagine. The status quo is easy to imagine. The counterfactuals, other forms of research, are only easy to imagine when we take the time to create them. So this is a very difficult thing to wrap our minds around. Now, you might think that this is a reason to scale back down and go back to the simpler version again, where we just focus on the harm to the research subjects in terms of pain and suffering and the promise of scientific and medical breakthroughs. But I think a different conclusion is warranted. In the case of human subjects research, we recognize that given all of the uncertainties with harm-benefit analysis, given the idea that humans have moral standing, and given that we know that when there are this many uncertainties, we will often do the analysis in a way that magically leads to the outcome we were hoping for, we set constraints on our application of harm-benefit analysis. We say we simply will not allow harmful, invasive, non-consensual, non-therapeutic research on vulnerable populations for the benefit of dominating populations. And we moreover say that when we do conduct risky or harmful research on vulnerable populations, it needs to be below a minimal threshold of risk, and it needs to benefit that population. I think we should say the same for non-human subjects research, and that will constrain our application of harm-benefit analysis moving forward.
So I'm a practicing neuroscientist, and although I share many of the aspirations that Jeff expressed, I also live in the real world. And in my world, I think it's essential. I think most scientists, all biomedical scientists effectively think it's essential to understand the cellular and molecular mechanisms that make us who we are and make us work the way we do. And at the moment, there are no techniques available to study those cellular and molecular mechanisms invasively in human subjects that are morally acceptable for the reasons that Jeff articulated. Therefore, the only choice we have is to do experiments in animals. Now, I mean, it's worth examining why it is that we think it's okay to do things in animals and not, let's say, in humans of, let's say, diminished mental capacity or other things. So a strict utilitarian approach to science might say that you know, humans of some debased kind might be acceptable subjects for scientific research, but we all accept that the community of humans is distinct from and different from the community of other animals. And so what we're implicitly buying into is something that I've seen referred to as the concept of graded moral status. We accept that humans have a special status and that other animals are entitled to compassionate treatment, they're entitled to our care, they're entitled to well-being, but they are less entitled than other humans are. And that's the basis with which that we can proceed to do experiments on them that we would not be able to do with humans. We also, because moral status is graded, we might do things on a fly that we wouldn't consider doing on a chimpanzee. And so there's a series of these, in effect, gray decisions that sort of fly in the face of a black and white charge to say, this experiment is worthwhile, this experiment is not worthwhile, this experiment will lead to a brilliant immediate outcome with a therapeutic benefit, and this experiment will not. Science is an imperfect business, and scientists are imperfect individuals, just as everyone else is. And so we do things that we believe to be the best bets that we can make about learning truths about nature, which we believe will lead to better understanding of the processes of nature, and in turn to the processes of disease and to cures for diseases. Not everything we do is designed to cure disease. Not everything we do is going to work. Not everything we do is going to be necessarily all that well conceived. We do our best, and our best is often not good enough. But I think it's a fundamental mistake to say that because science individually occasionally will fail, that the whole enterprise is to be questioned. And I guess I'm still, while talking, rolling over to my mind, the counterfactual approach that Jeff proposes, because I find that extremely difficult to imagine. I think there are many branches of science and many people in many areas of science who have been trying for centuries to devise experimental methods to learn the same sorts of things that I would like to learn. And so far, I think it's fair to say that none of them has succeeded. So I think, in a sense, the counterfactual world that Jeff imagines is one that actually already exists. It's been tried. The fact is that if you want to learn the things that we try to learn, the methods that we use are the ones that you have to use. Now, we do them as humanely as we can. Mark and I will perhaps later on address the various ways in which we reduce the risks and harms to the degree possible. We do them when possible, as NIH mandates, with what they call the lowest possible species, the lowest possible animals to study a function. So that, for example, if you're comparing experiments that you might do on a non-human primate, on a monkey, and compare experiments that you might do on a worm or on a mouse, there is a choice of organism which is based on principled beliefs founded on what we know about the relationship between how those organisms are built and how they relate to the functions of humans. The goal for most of us is to understand how human life works and how human diseases work. And therefore, what we want to do is choose to use the animals that are closest to us, that are consistent with gaining knowledge. Now, I may have an opportunity later, I won't go on it now, but my personal belief is that we have been pressed to use lower animals a little bit too hard. So of the NIH budget, something like 75% is spent on experiments on mice, and 4% is spent on experiments on non-human primates and monkeys. And I think there's good reason to believe that many of those mouse experiments, as Jeff actually indicated, don't necessarily translate very effectively to humans. And I think the argument can be made that the difference is that those animals are too distant from us physiologically and evolutionarily to provide a good model for the kind of things that we would like to understand. So if one can do an experiment on, let's say, 100 monkeys instead of on 10,000 mice, and learn more that is of value and of direct relationship to function in humans, then I think that's a trade we should take. And yet the pressures we work under often push us away from work on higher animals and towards work on lower animals, even when that's imperfect. So there's a point for discussion there, which we may be able to pick up later. The use of animals in biomedical science is almost universally agreed by biomedical scientists to be essential for progress. Now, we have not, I think, done a particularly effective job of conveying that to the public, and that's why I'm sorry I neglected to thank Jen and ScAAN for organizing, and my colleagues in doing that, because I think it's actually very important that these principles get articulated and get discussed and people get questioned, because the public exposure of how it is that we think, how it is that we decide to do the things we do, and why we believe that the balance between the harms and the benefits in our work are appropriate is something that I think is very much worth discussing with all of you and with the wider community. So instead of beginning with my thanks, I'll end with my thanks and hand over to Carol.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Jen. I just want to echo the same set of considerations about the importance of having open and transparent discussions about the use of animals in research. I do think there's a tendency that to not have these discussions, in part because of entrenched fear on both sides, fear and and different sorts of sort of emotional reactions on both sides, that there's no common ground, and thus sort of discussion falls apart. And so I, again, really am happy that this sort of forum has been created to have a discussion across those things. My role, I'm the only one not at NYU, so I'm at the Hastings Center, which is a bioethics research institute just off the Hudson River in Garrison, New York. And my background is in philosophy, but I also feel like my role on this panel is somewhat of the regulatory person, having sat in an IACUC, and in part because of the realities of living in the real world, recognizing that incremental change in how we use animals in research is likely to happen through the mechanisms that we already have in place for oversight of animal research, sort of steeped myself in that world a little bit to sort of think about what are the levers we can push or pull, where can we make some changes, suggest ways of going that move us toward the direction that I think, Jeff, you would totally advocate for, but recognizing that change is slow and, again, incremental. So just to sort of lay out, especially the sort of history and regulations, IACUCs, or institutional animal care and use committees, are a committee that every research facility in the United States is required to have, whether that's a university or a private research institution like a pharmaceutical company. Any institution that performs research involving species covered by the Animal Welfare Act must have an IACUC. A really weird quirk of the Animal Welfare Act is that mice and rats are not covered under the Act. So for the purposes of Animal Welfare Act, mice and rats are not actually animals, and thus not considered formally under the purview of the institutional animal care and use committees at those research facilities, thousands of them across the United States. However, any institution that receives NIH funding or any other federal funding, so it goes well beyond NIH, any institution that receives federal funding must also comply with the Guide for the Care and Use of Animals, laboratory animals. And that does include mice and rats under its purview. So Under the Animal Welfare Act, mice and rats are not considered animals, not under the purview, but under these other guidelines from the NIH, from the Public Health Service, of which the NIH is part, they are. So most IACUCs are also reviewing all of those protocols. And the purpose of the IACUC is to review and either approve or not approve any protocol involving all non-human animals, we'll call it that, to be simple. And they're often doing some version of harm-benefit analysis in this, although that the term is not used in the legislation. And they're looking at what is the expected societal benefit? Is there a sort of societal benefit to this research? And also, to a certain extent, what is the likelihood of the proposed experiment to actually produce the knowledge that is promised, and thus, unlock the enormous benefits of animal research. And then, also looking, coupled with that, at the level of pain, distress, harm, and suffering to the animals, and the extent to which that will be mitigated by excellent veterinarians being involved in the process of the care and keeping of animals. IACUCs also do inspections of research facilities. So if you work in a lab here, you might have interacted with IACUC members, both by giving them your protocols for review, but also perhaps in the lab when various IACUC members do their annual inspections. They also involved in training, oftentimes training especially graduate students and lab techs and others who are involved in care and keeping of animals, above and beyond the actual experimental protocol. IACUCs were created in 1985, so they're relatively recent, actually, invention of the US Congress and those who had proposed them in 1985. And were actually proposed in part in response to the various reports, and credible ones, of horrible abuse of animals in research facilities around the world. So one way of shoring up public trust that the scientific enterprise isn't the wild, wild west that's just doing willy-nilly with animals, whatever they want, that there is a sort of trustworthy process for the oversight of animal research that, again, the public can sort of be somewhat comforted by the fact that there is a sort of arbiter of whether or not an experimental protocol can move forward. And part of why the IACUC sort of earns our trust and is deserving of our trust is that the members of the IACUC come from a variety of backgrounds. So there's scientists who have to be, the committee structure is actually, again, in the law. It has to have scientists, but also at least one non-scientist member, which is often someone affiliated with the university but is not a scientist, like an ethicist or a clergy or sociologist, and someone who's not in the hard sciences. I like to think of social sciences as quite important. And also a non-affiliated member, which I like to call the community member. So someone who's not affiliated at all with the university in any way, shape, or form, who comes as a representative of the community's interest on the IACUC. And so every IACUC has at least those three categories of members, but often IACUCs have upwards of 20 members, part just because of the logistical issues with reaching quorum at every IACUC meeting. And veterinarians are also incredibly important parts of IACUCs. So again, the rationale behind the creation of this committee, and again, why you all have to submit your protocols to them, is the idea that the IACUC serves this really important role in ensuring and that the scientific enterprise is deserving of public trust. Now, there are lots of sort of challenges and limitations of the IACUC model. One is that all of the things that Jeff has laid on the table for us very nicely are not considered in an IACUC. So the sort of scope of analysis, what IACUCs actually look at in the process of review, is somewhat limited by the mandate in the Animal Welfare Act to sort of consider very specific aspects of the protocol, like pain and suffering and societal benefit, but not necessarily instructing them to do sort of more complicated harm-benefit analysis. Another is that oftentimes IACUC members really lack the expertise to do, and time, so there's sort of two major constraints on reviewing protocols. So, hundreds of protocols might come across NICA, depending on the size of the research facility every year. And everyone's time is limited, and everyone's capacity and expertise is limited. So, oh goodness, one of the major challenges is that some protocols are getting short shrift and kind of a rubber stamping. And I'll just mention one more, which is the skewed representation. Most in the protocol, in the law, at least one person has to be a non-scientist and one a community member, but nonetheless, the overwhelming majority of members are scientists, and so there is a bit of groupthink in the committee structure and a really indebtedness to how important using animals in research is, and a huge commitment on the part of invested interest in the part of the committee members to keep this going, despite well-founded concerns. So these are all things I'm sure we'll get more into, but there's a little bit of regulatory history for you.
Thanks. So I'm going to open the panel up to cross-panel questions if any of you guys are interested.
Can I just follow? So Carolyn just gave a very clear account of how IACUCs work. What was left out was the fact that the first level of screening for almost all of the research that's done with animals at a place like NYU is not the IACUC, but is in fact the study section or review panel at an organization at NIH or NSF or another funding body or foundation. And it is explicitly the job of those review panels, rather than the IACUC, really, to make the decision about whether the proposed use of animals in the research is likely to produce the benefits that the investigators claim. So the IACUC is not the first level of review and nor the last line of defense. So proposals that reach the IACUC in almost all cases have already been through a stage of review at NIH. Now, you may believe, and I could certainly concur, I've served on both IACUCs and NIH review panels. Neither of those organizations are perfect, and the IACUC structure does have we'll call it features that you described. You might have thought of them as bugs, but there is another entire level of review in play, which I think has a very important influence on what gets to you. So at NIH these days, I think 1 in 6 proposals get funded, and so the rest have gone by the wayside before they reach the IACUC.
So I would just like to say that the way the IACUC has been formulated was a model based on IRBs coming out of the Nuremberg trials. And that model has come from consideration of the use of humans in research, and then has been extrapolated on to overseeing the use of animals. So one has to look at, again, I go back to history and evolving understanding of pain, suffering. There are benchmarks over history, the use of anesthetics, use of analgesics, germ theory, all kinds of things that have been benchmarks along the way. We could not have been brought to the understanding that we have now without using animals as models for human physiology, human understanding. So the Jeff's cost-benefit analysis is important, but it's a question of what do we consider ourselves and what do we consider animals? Is it okay for us to use animals as a model for humans for the benefit of both humans and animals, and to what degree should we be allowed to do so? And these are not easy questions. These are just not easy questions, but there's no doubt about the benefit that has been achieved at this point by using animals in research. And also, one can go back to baby Faye. So the point that we have not used humans in invasive and extreme research over time has just not been true. 1,000 years ago, we were throwing people into stadiums to kill each other. We were, animals. We would torture. Vivisection in women were commonplace. And as things progressed, pets were not even considered. Animals were not even considered conscious beings until the 18th century. So there is a progression over time, and we need to keep things in that perspective as we move along. Now, many people think we're not moving fast enough, and we'll talk a little we'll talk a little bit about technological advances that will, again, bring us closer to what Jeff is kind of promoting. Because as we understand these mechanisms of the cellular basis of things, we can become less invasive. We can gain the knowledge and the data we need by putting less of a footprint on animals and keeping them more in a natural state. And we can get to talk about zoos as opposed to estuaries and all that kind of thing. But so we're going to further along that discussion.
It may be useful to give a sort of example of what you mean by moving towards more of a natural state. What does that actually mean?
So the trend, so there are the 3 R's, and this was developed in 1958, and they're the foundation of what we consider to be humane use of animal. And one of the most dynamic aspects of that is something called refinement. Place animals whenever possible, reduce the number of animals to that, which is the minimum needed for significance. But the third concept, which is refinement, which is the most dynamic. So we're constantly looking of how. So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but just quickly, how can we bring animals in and keep them in their most natural state while we're getting the needed data that we need out of them? Because if we cause them undue stress, if we put them in an artificial environment, we're not getting the best data. So we're constantly looking for ways to be less invasive on animals as we put them in this. It is an artificial environment. They are working animals, and this gets back to what is our relationship with animals. Are we allowed to have working? Are we allowed to use animals as part of a working part of society? And what are animals? We'll get more into that in terms of the animals that are in the wild as opposed to the animals that are within our sphere of consideration. So it's a very complex issue. Okay, that's it.
So there are, of course, a lot of threads to pick up on. I think the main thing, and I imagine a lot of it will come out in the Q&A, I think the main thing that I want to touch on now is the point that has come up several times about the relative moral status or moral standing of human and non-human animals, and this idea that we should accept a scalar conception of moral standing that places humans above non-human animals. So there are a few things that I want to say quickly about that. The first is that while I do think that there are good reasons to take seriously a scalar conception of moral standing, I think that that would have to apply across human and non-human populations. The separation between human and non-human populations that marks us as a special species and non-human animals as lesser than and scalable, I think is not justifiable. In general, species are nothing more than one of very many taxonomic categories, morally arbitrary taxonomic categories that scientists have created for purposes of explaining and predicting and controlling observable phenomena. These are social constructs. They do not matter intrinsically. All they do is help us organize reality into simple categories so that we can wrap our heads around it a little bit more easily. That is not the kind of thing that can ground a separate kind of moral standing and moral dignity apart from the rest of animals, especially when you consider what kinds of taxonomic categories species are. They are dynamic categories. There is a lot of variation within species, a lot of similarity across species, and a lot of change in species over time. Moreover, when we think about what it is that gives us the kind of moral standing that makes it not okay to perform this kind of research on us, we do not think about how we happen to be classified in a biology textbook. We think about the fact that we have morally relevant features like consciousness and emotionality and a sense of self and bonds of care and interdependence with each other and with other animals. Those are the features that when we reflect on our own moral standing, make us think that we have this kind of inviolable moral standing. And if we are going to be both inclusive and consistent and live up to modern conceptions of human rights and human justice that are anti-ageist, anti-ableist, and so on, we would extend that same kind of inclusive conception of moral standing to non-human animals. Now, there is a further difficult question about whether we should be egalitarian or scalar about moral standing. Should we be egalitarian? That sounds nice in the human case because we could avoid ranking humans based on, for example, cognitive capacity, which is ableist and bad. But then again, when we think about me versus an ant, the scalar approach seems awfully compelling, right? Now, I think that there are good arguments in both directions and don't want to try to resolve that issue now, but I will say that even if we do take a scalar approach, the appropriate scale would not make it the case that the kinds of harmful invasive non-human subjects research that are routinely conducted would be morally justifiable according to an appropriately weighted cost-benefit analysis. I think that we would have to take seriously the fact that a lot of this research would still be unjustifiable, as again, we see in the human case. Even if we could learn things from performing certain types of harmful, risky research on unwilling populations, we are willing to forego the benefits of that knowledge because we recognize that the moral costs are too high. And I think that when we think about words like essential and necessary in this context, we need to appreciate that these are value-laden terms. We are saying that it is essential or necessary in a way that justifies the moral cost at stake. And that, I think, is something that we morally ought to question.
I feel like I'm jumping Carolyn, but I didn't want to say, Jeff, as a biologist, I actually can't accept the notion that a species is a social construct. It's a biological construct, and it's well-founded in genetics and physiology, reproductive physiology, if nothing else. Now, the question of what gradations exist and how close species are and so on are all debatable points, and we could have an interesting evening debating them. It is a fact of modern society, which you might wish to change, and which I might wish to change under some circumstances, that we make a distinction between humans and non-human animals. And that's where the concept of these graded moral status things come from, as you well know. What I also wanted to do, though, was to make the point that you've said, and it's perfectly clear, there are reprehensible things that humans used to do to other humans in the name of research, and we don't do those things anymore. There are also reprehensible things that humans used to do to animals in the name of research, which we don't do anymore. So there are many kinds of experiments on animals that we regard as unacceptable, and that we would not conduct whatever the benefits were that we perceived to result from them. That's in part because of the improvements in the understanding of how we can do these experiments, and also improvements in our understanding of the harms that come to animals under the circumstances of certain kinds of experiments. So there are certain kinds of knowledge that we do not permit ourselves to obtain from humans, and there are certain kinds of knowledge that we do not permit ourselves to obtain from animals. So it's not, I think, qualitatively different, it's quantitatively different, as it should be. And so there are many sort of shades of judgment to be taken all the way along this continuum.
Do you want to respond to the social construct?
Not at length, just to say, I suspect we might be talking past each other there. I think that I'm using the word social construct in a way that many biologists at least might accept for many taxonomic categories that they think capture important distinctions in reality. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, so speciation is an interesting topic in biology.
Yeah.
We can go to Darwin and everything.
Right. And I also just want to add that I completely agree with you on several points that you and others on this panel have made. So first of all, I do accept and appreciate that people do draw the kinds of lines that I'm advocating for now in ways that we did not used to do. So we have shifted the moral baseline for acceptable non-human subjects research in a way that I think animal activists often do not give people credit for. And I want to acknowledge that we have learned extremely valuable things through non-human subjects research too. I think one of the outcomes of the polarized nature of this discourse is that proponents tend to exaggerate the benefits and opponents tend to exaggerate the costs and not acknowledge the benefits. So I want to acknowledge that there have been benefits and that there are more lines that we draw. I just think that the cost-benefit analysis should be subtler and that the more lines that we draw should be way further down the road than they are. And I'm happy that people are working within institutions to produce incremental reforms. And I'm happy that people are working outside of the institutions to apply social pressure so that they do that a little bit faster. So I think all of that is needed. And my role is like some weird place in the middle, because I've done the IACUC thing and the biomedical thing, and now I sort of do the external social pressure application thing to some degree. So I occupy a weird space in this conversation. But I do appreciate the work that everybody is doing within the space too.
Within the space of regulatory bodies, we talk about them as exerting positive pressures on scientists and experimentalists. How can they themselves be improved? Like you said, there are a lot of drawbacks with the IACUC model. Often they require a community member, non-scientist to be on board. But if you're a grad student, you know how difficult it is to explain what your research is to a general audience that would be understandable within the time frame of one of these study groups or an IACUC meeting. How do we actually make sure that those votes are actually informed?
Sorry, graduate students typically don't propose individual work to study sections or to.
Sorry, I just think that it's very difficult sometimes to condense the amount of scientific knowledge that would be necessary to really understand the potential benefits of an experiment. And
So let me pick that up if I may. So people, non-scientists especially, often, not looking at you as a non-scientist, but you're a budding scientist, shall we say. But non-scientists often assume that scientists know a great deal more about the outcomes of experiments they initiate than they do, right? What we do is we take the best bet we can about the procedures that we can do that are within our technical capability. But the idea that we can guarantee an outcome of an experiment is sort of flies in the face of how science works. Science often fails. There's a wonderful book which I commend to all of you who are interested in how science works. It's written by a colleague of mine at Columbia called Stuart Firestein, and it's called Ignorance and How It Drives Science. And he describes science, his metaphor for science is like trying to find a black cat in a dark room, except you're not sure there's a cat. And that's, we of course like to trumpet our great successes, okay, and we don't like to sing about our failures. But the fact is that when you're judging whether a piece of work is likely to yield useful results, it's not a matter of being nice or being weak or being flabby. It's a matter of essential, it is essential to the conduct of science that you take a generous view of what is likely or plausibly going to lead to an advance. You can't get a guarantee, you never will. That's just the way things work. And that is something that I fully understand a lot of people find hard to grasp. In fact, somewhere along the questions you sent us were questions about the Booker bill, which is based in part on the premise that you can know in advance what the outcome of an experiment is. And it's just not the way things work. And so there's a fundamental gap of understanding, which I think panels like this can actually help to bridge.
I mean, one issue is also that not so enlightened scientists also assume that they have a lot more knowledge than non-scientists, and that really undermines the power and authority that the non-scientists and community members, non-scientists have to raise any sort of concerns, because they sort of themselves become absorb information that they're getting from the room, which is that you don't have the requisite knowledge and expertise to raise any technical issues or any concerns about this protocol, which is what most of the other people in the room are thinking, right? You are a token member that's required by the Animal Welfare Act to be here. And as long as you sit in the room, we're good. We can have our discussion, but if you don't show up, we've got a problem. So we just need to keep coming. I mean, that's really cynical and not fair to the most enlightened scientists and the most enlightened academics, but unfortunately in practice is prevalent. So I think that the unfair assumptions are on both sides of that the non-scientist scientist divide on the IACUC.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I have to say that the community member and the lay member on the IACUC seem to me to be designed to serve a laudable purpose, but the mechanism by which they're supposed to serve that purpose is flawed.
So one of my favorite papers is by a legal scholar, Rebecca Dressner, who says that the community member has been set up for an impossible task. I mean, you can't possibly, what does it mean to represent the general community's interest on a committee of 5 people? I mean, there's no general community interest in animal research. I mean, it's like to say that there's one interest that person's representing. But we have lots of interests and lots of competing intuitions and competing worldviews about this enterprise. So to sort of assume that one person can stand in for the general community interest is, again, setting this one person up to sort of fail in an impossible task. So I've been thinking through ways in which we can conceptualize this role. And again, this is coming from Dresser, but it's a role I find really compelling, is that the person sits in the room as a reminder to fellow committee members, but also the sort of wider university community, that other people are interested in your work. That you are, in a very general sense, accountable not to this one person, but to the wider society. That science doesn't operate in a vacuum, it sits within a really complex, messy society that has lots of competing views. And this person just isn't representing anything, but serves as a constant reminder of the outside world to people within a university who and within a research facility who very much become ingratiated in this sense that this is so important, this is the most important thing I could be doing right now, and I will fight tooth and nail to make sure I can do it. And it's really important that attitude exists too, because it has propelled medical advances. But again, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You are certainly not necessarily accountable, but should be able to transparent to the outside world.
I mean, I think it's worth, I mean, I agree, actually. I mean, I think it's often hard, I would imagine, the job of the community members are, although I have to say that having served on IACUCs, the community members with whom I've served have actually often been both insightful and influential on those committees. But the community member is not the only way that society represents itself in deciding what science gets done. Science policy is set by legislation, by elected representatives, that funds the work that the NIH funds. That work is in turn also monitored at various levels by community members from the councils of the various funding institutes. So the membership of IACUCs is only one of a set of mechanisms that society uses to do what absolutely it should do, which is to make us accountable for the public money that we spend on the research that we do. It is our obligation to account for why we do what we do, and this is one of many mechanisms that are supposed to help do that.
So if I may say, without being too self-promoting, that this is why the veterinarians that are now specializing in laboratory animal medicine have done so. This is our role. Our role is to make sure that the committee has a we're generalists. We're specialists, but we're also generalists. So we are there to assist the committee to make sure that somebody is speaking for the animals. Now, we're speaking for the animals in the context of research and benefit to society in that context, but we are there to assist the outside member to understand what's going on. We're there to make sure, and not only the veterinarians, by the way, but there is a dedicated staff of laboratory animal professionals that are looking at these animals every day. It's a relatively new concept called post-approval monitoring, which is once a protocol is approved, you need to take a look at what's going on, and you need to look at these animals on a daily basis. And these are dedicated individuals that bring any issues to the attention. And animals are looked at 7 days a week. The vet staff is on call 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to attend to the well-being and the government. So those regulatory entities understand this and give veterinarians authority that even though, yes, there's a conflict of interest, we are paid by the institution, but we have authority to outside that institution. We can stop any work at any time and bring a issue for review. So there are safeguards in place.
For a specific example, I think we maybe talked about it a little bit before. It was like, for instance, getting skylights or something like that for animals, whether it's beneficial, potentially beneficial for the quality of the research to have natural light. I'm wondering at what institutional level do veterinarians get to raise their hand and say, perhaps we should structure the facility in a certain way?
So one of the great advances, and this is fairly recent, that most programs now have a behavioralist and an enrichment specialist full-time on staff to make sure that, again, talking about lessening the artificial footprint on the animal. Now, I don't know when these were part of the questions that he kind of brought to the fore, but one has to understand that at this point, animals are not brought out of the wild into the research environment. All animals are reared in a facility under highly controlled conditions, and then are brought to the research arena. If you're a rodent, you're going to be humanized, and most rodents now are genetically engineered, so we can talk about the suffering because some of them are made to exhibit illness, and this can cause suffering. So humane endpoints, humane care is all part of the discussion. All has to be part of the planning that goes into any research project. So there are safeguards, and again, I'll go back to progress over time, because as everybody here recognizes on this panel, things are much better than they were even when I started in terms of how we consider animal awareness, how we consider animals as sentient beings that we need to respect and care for and consider. And as Tony described, we do not do anything to these animals. They are in the context of what is humane and what is considered ethical to current standards. And these standards will evolve over time. And again, we'll talk about how the technology, so, you know, we've been at war in this country for what, 30 years. There are thousands and thousands of people without limbs, and we're getting closer and closer to brain artificial limb technology. And this cannot be possible without ethical and humane use of animals. There's so many different aspects of this that are under discussion, but that doesn't lessen the conversation of how we need to consider ourselves as beings and our relationship to animals and how this is evolving over time.
Just add one quick thing, which is not an argument for or against anything, but a genuine complication. And this goes back to something that you were saying before. I think most people who are scientists or most people who study scientists appreciate that the way science progresses is not through people conducting individual studies with a clear sense of what those individual studies will show and what progress those individual studies will lead to. Science is often undirected, and it requires a huge population of people to be conducting a wide range of different types of experiments without much of a sense of what will happen as a result of the experiments. And then only as a result of this collective enterprise of a bunch of people pursuing their curiosity will you get to the breakthroughs that happen in surprising ways in surprising places, right? And this is part of what makes it really difficult to regulate this in a way that really adheres to strict ethical standards. Because if you try to narrow the types of studies that are permitted to the ones where you can clearly establish in advance that they're likely to result in the types of breakthroughs that are going to help people to have limbs and so on and so forth, then you might not have the diversity of types of experiments that genuinely will, in surprising ways, lead to that progress. On the other hand, once you make that observation, it becomes a really tempting rationalization to do whatever the hell you want, independently of what the cost-benefit analysis shows, and to justify whatever it is that you happen to be doing by pointing to the sort of need for undirected science where people are exploring their curiosity. And this is a huge epistemic hurdle that makes it really difficult to sort experiments prospectively into the morally good and morally bad category from a cost-benefit analysis. Now, this is part of why I think, and we can debate where that line should be, that probably the most thoughtful way to approach this issue is to draw a certain line in the sand and simply prohibit certain types of especially harmful research independently of the expected benefits. But then you do have to allow for the types of science that genuinely will make life better for human and non-human animals. And then that becomes an empirical debate about how broad that category needs to be, how many alternatives can be realistically included, and so on. And that question is just very difficult to answer at present.
So if I may, I'd like to actually bring up a specific case up. And I like this specific case for a number of reasons. But one of the things it does is it makes clear that the kinds of judgments that we would all like to be able to make prospectively can actually only be made retrospectively. And the case is the case of models of Parkinson's disease that were devised about 20 years ago when people noticed that one of the consequences of the abuse of the drug ecstasy, for which the chemical name is NPTP, and don't ask me what it stands for, was a Parkinson's-like condition that was developed by the people who abused the drug. That suggested that scientists might be able to use NPTP to create an animal model for Parkinson's disease, which is a disorder which we know to involve certain groups of cells in a part of the brain called basal ganglia, but the dysfunction of those cells had not previously been studied. So a number of groups started to use NPTP to basically create Parkinson's disease artificially in monkeys. Turns out Parkinson's is a disease you can't study in mice because the organization of that part of the brain in mice is simply not close enough to humans to create a similar phenotype. But so the NPTP monkeys were the foundation of a research program led by a guy called Madeline DeLong, who works at Emory University in Atlanta. And DeLong, who had long been interested in the function of the basal ganglia and had these monkeys to study, developed a technique on the basis of his analysis that was based on his idea that if you delivered electrical stimuli artificially to certain parts of the basal ganglia circuit, you might be able to relieve the symptoms of the disease. This has led to the treatment which has been used in many tens of thousands of human patients, which is deep brain stimulation to relieve the symptoms of Parkinson's It's an extremely effective treatment, and it's obviously not a cure, it's a palliative, but it has improved the lives of many thousands of humans at the cost of the lives and undoubtedly the harms to, scores, maybe 100 monkeys that worked in DeLong's lab. The reason I like this case is, first of all, it bears on something that actually Karen's written about, which is whether genetically modified organisms that simulate human diseases should or could be created, because there is actually now a Parkinson's monkey model. But it also is a case which led Peter Singer, who's of course famous as a philosopher at animal liberation and one of the most articulate of those who have cast doubt on the whole enterprise of animal research, to agree that this was actually a case which in retrospect, not in prospect, but in retrospect, was worthwhile because in a utilitarian sense, the lives of the 100 monkeys could be set against the relief of the suffering of the tens of thousands of humans who received deep brain stimulation. Now, I'm not going to say that everything we do is going to lead to the next DBS, but I think it's an interesting case because it started from a basic exploration of the circuits of the basal ganglia, and it led to a very important treatment for an important disorder. So, I like that case.
Great. We're going to open the floor up now to audience questions.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Also very abstract, so it's sometimes a little bit hard for somebody outside the field to get a sense of exactly what the group of you might be disagreeing over. So maybe you don't hear about concrete cases you just got one, but Jeff, I mean, as perhaps the primary advocate of change towards more restrictive regulations here, maybe it'd be useful to hear maybe a concrete case of a kind of animal-like experimentation that might be going on in neuroscience right now that you think shouldn't be permitted, and why, and maybe we could hear why.
Yeah,
Other people's perspective on that.
so I myself have a little bit of uncertainty here, and so I want to acknowledge that. I'm not exactly sure where I myself want to draw the line, but I think a good place to start while acknowledging the many relevant differences between human and non-human research subjects is to ask where we might draw the line with vulnerable human populations. And as I was saying before, I think that the place we would draw that line at a minimum with vulnerable human populations is harmful and invasive, non-consensual, non-therapeutic laboratory research on vulnerable populations. That does allow for lots of really interesting types of research where you can learn a lot of really interesting types of things. But for example, it would not allow breeding animals so that they are born with particular injuries or illnesses so that we can then regard that as therapeutic research and study those injuries or illnesses so that we could potentially allow this study to contribute to a broad range of studies that will lead to some sort of breakthrough. I actually do think that we should work toward a ban of that entire research category and invest in alternatives. I think that there will be transition costs and various other costs, and it might delay certain benefits. And obviously, there are all sorts of legal and institutional constraints on developing those alternatives and investing in them really quickly. But ultimately, I think that as with shifts away from all types of institutions that are causing more harm than they need to, we have to accept those transition costs. And I really hope that, for example, especially younger scientists who are starting out in their careers, who are in graduate school right now, or starting out in postdocs and deciding what kinds of labs they want to work in, that they might then be able to set it up in such a way that they're investing in new technologies and alternatives so that they can simply find replacements for that category of research at least. Now, I haven't described a particular experiment.
Yeah, Jeff, can I just
Yeah,
ask?
yeah.
Are you talking about all research involved in creating transgenic models of human diseases? Is that a category that you're interested in closing out?
I would have to think about possible borderline cases, and I would be interested in hearing about cases where you could construct those types of models in a way that would live up to current standards of rights and justice. But I think that, as far as I understand it, and I'm very happy to be corrected, as far as I understand it, it's ordinarily the case that when you create these models, you expectedly subject them to certain types of harms and suffering that we would regard as a non-starter in the case of relevantly similar human populations.
So let me just elaborate a bit on the case I just spoke about. So the MPTV monkey model for Parkinson's disease has been the standard model for a couple of decades. It's the only way we know to kill off that population of neurons and create an animal that simulates in its phenotype the way human Parkinson's patients are. People have recently begun to develop genetically modified marmoset monkeys that have, in effect, a genetic lesion that causes them to develop Parkinson's disease, or something very much like Parkinson's disease. The work is in its early stage, hasn't even been published yet. I heard about it in a meeting and talked about it with people who were doing it. But I would suggest that there are ways in which that model is perhaps better and certainly no worse than the model in which you take a monkey and poison it with NPTP. NPTP is a toxin. We do things that are equivalent to giving toxins to animals in order to create simulations of diseases, or we make lesions of their brains to try and simulate, to try and learn about the functions of different parts of the brain. So we have for as long as animal research has been going on, we have been damaging animals in an attempt to learn the consequences of damage and infer the functions of the brain. Now, a genetic method for doing that damage is, to my way of thinking, on principle different from any other method. And in fact, in some ways, it can be cleaner and it can be more restricted and less harmful and can cause less suffering. So I don't want to defend every example, and I think you probably don't want to condemn every example. And actually, Carolyn probably knows more about this than I do. But this seems to be an interesting area.
Yeah. So just very briefly, I agree with you about that. And this might be one of those situations where one person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens. By which I mean, I agree that these are relevantly similar, and so I think we should ban wolves rather than agreeing that they're relevantly similar, and so we should accept both. But I do agree that I'm open to the possibility that there are cases of either inflicting certain types of damage or breeding with certain types of damage that would be sufficiently non-harmful that it would be permissible, but I'm not certain about that.
Can I just actually provide another example, another more concrete example of a pretty unambiguously non-clinical case? I'm going to draw two examples, one which you may understand and one which a broader audience may understand. First one being decoding uncertainty in the brain. Sorry, Rachel, to pick an example from your lab, but it's one that I'm most familiar with. So for instance, taking a macaque monkey and recording from cortical neurons and trying to decode whether or not there's some kind of actual readout that is comparable to a Bayesian prior or a Bayesian likelihood for a kind of task that might be like visual orientation for things, and their read of that visual orientation. So that might be one that, correct me if I'm wrong, would you please feel free to jump in. I don't think that there is any direct sort of clinical benefit on par with what you're talking about. The second might be something like a neuroeconomics case, which hopefully is an example that's more accessible to the broader audience. So something like juice preference curves, like providing monkeys with different sort of like types of juice and recording from different locuses in the brain to try to figure out sort of what happens when there's something that's more comfortable than another. I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, may also be another.
Well, so look, I mean, so it is often said that scientists who are exploring basic principles like the representation of uncertainty in the brain are seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake, as if sort of to entertain ourselves and satisfy our intellectual curiosity. But it's, I think, unreasonable, and history certainly tells you that it's often not true, to assume that that knowledge will not later on lead to an advance that you do not now foresee. And so, actually, I have written in bold here on my notes, but I'll just read it. The NIH the principles that NIH uses for deciding what it should do are to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. And what's implicit in that statement is that you have to have the foundations of knowledge before you can devise the applications to enhance health and prolong life and reduce disability. And not all advances in knowledge can be predicted to give that outcome. Now, I can make up a story for you, I won't, but I could make up a story for you about how learning about the representation of uncertainty in the brain could be something that was consequential for an understanding of certain kinds of mental illness, for example. I mean, one can certainly imagine applications of things that seem terribly arcane and terribly sort of abstract when you first hear about them. So I think it's a very risky business indeed to judge whether or not something is likely to lead in the foreseeable future to a cure. I think we can tell the difference between good science and bad science. We all have views on how that, on that, and we hope that as little bad science and as much good science as possible gets done. But I think it's very much harder to say this is good science, which is also going to lead to a cure.
It's going to be put on the spot, right?
I want to just be Gio, on your question on the day-to-day, what happens with these animals, because I think that's really what we're getting down to here. So it is true that a hole is drilled in the skull of a primate in order to insert a recording device, and you're asking that animal to do things for it. Again, and we can debate whether that is acceptable, you know, but the fact is that now, again, I go back to history, the progression of things over time. Whereas one might expect an animal such as that to live maybe 3 years after you begin your recording, we have animals now living for 15 years that undergo this because we have made progress in the way that we take care of the animals, keep them normal in the research environment, protect them, keep them, you know, happy is a weird way. It's a weird thing, but things like giving them iPads to play with, you know, swimming pools. I mean, we have a dating service. The enrichment specialist is taking care of them on a day-to-day basis. So now we have to put in geriatric protocols. Is it okay? At what age is it not acceptable that they become, their eyesight starts to go, their hearing starts to go, you give them a cane to walk around with, you know? At what age should we withdraw them from research protocols? Because we've got to the point where we are taking really good care of them, we're keeping them normal, and we're getting amazing data from them. And so, what do you withdraw them?
Can I pick up one thing, because I think it's important, and I think everybody in the room probably recognizes, it is possible to create a description of the things that are done to research animals, which sounds absolutely ghoulish to a layperson. It sounds like it would cause indescribable suffering. Right? And the fact of the matter is that it is possible, and indeed it is an aspiration of all of us who do invasive scientific research, to do these things in a way that creates as little suffering as possible. And as Mark indicates, we're actually very good at it, and we have objective measures of that. The animals, you know, one can tell the difference. And there's a very tricky thing here because anthropomorphism gets into play very quickly here. But it is possible through a variety of objective behavioral techniques to establish whether a monkey is distressed or not. It's actually much easier, I think, in my view, to do that for a monkey than it is for a rat or a mouse.
But it's also incredibly difficult to do in humans. And so, like, what we know about how we have no objective measures of pain and distress in humans.
And even more difficult to do, let's say, in a dolphin or in a creature for whom we have much less ease of anthropomorphic. But all we can do is objectively say, does this animal behave in the same way as other animals to whom we have not done these things? And so we can say yes or no to that. That's a relatively straightforward.
And
maybe it's sufficient, but it's at least an aspiration.
And I'm not going to say that there's not at times a discussion going on. You know, it's time. Let's start moving this animal in a direction. We have sent animals to retirement homes. I mean, you know.
Not human retirement.
No, but the point is that we are keenly aware of the well-being of these animals and how precious they are. Think of the time, effort, expense, just not even going for the intrinsic value of that sentient animal. But think of the time, years, training. So in a research project that's looking at brain function, you're building year after year to get an animal to a certain point and get the data to a certain complex level that you're putting together groups of neurons and understanding how they work in concert. You know, we discussed single neuron recording. It's no longer single, I'm nothing against what you're doing. But it's now arrays, and it's now understanding, you know, massive, you know, how things work in the sympathy, the way that neurons work together. And so it takes time to build up, and so it's really important work. So, I mean, it's still a societal discussion. It's still something that we need to set boundaries on, but yeah, that's the life of a research primate.
Okay, so Luigi.
All right, so I first of all just described as doing rather arcane research on the representation of uncertainty. So my collaborator, Andreas Holias, indeed works with non-human primates reporting from visual cortex and trying to test fundamental theories about mobility and uncertainty in the brain. I agree with Tony completely that there is a future potential for making those kinds of investigations relevant to mental health. We write about that when we write our grants. At the same time, I also struggle with those justifications because I do think intent matters. So there are scientists who work with animals or who collaborate with animal experimentists who truly want to cure human disease, and they work towards that no matter how distant that goal. And for them, the work that they write in AIDS grants is genuine. Right? To be honest, many scientists, including myself, when we write that work, it is sort of an afterthought. And what we're truly interested in is the curiosity-driven question. We want to answer the basic research question. If there is a application down the line, that's a beautiful extra. We'll write about it. We'll play that up a little bit. But that's not why we do it. And I think that matters because if you are driven by clinically relevant questions, then you will do other kinds of experiments. So that puts me in a very conflicted position, obviously. I don't know how to resolve this completely, but I do think intent matters and intent needs to be talked about.
So I actually think this is a really important distinction between sort of like societal benefit that we often talk about in ethics literature and even in regulatory literature versus like the expectations of this experiment, which are much, much more modest. and like to sort of what's the intent is to produce this bit of knowledge in this experiment, not to cure cancer 20 years, hundreds of years from now, but to do this thing. And this is, I think, actually a really important point because it makes it seem possible to maybe make progress. And how can we make that possible? Because sometimes the sort of curing cancer obscures actually like sort of the looking at how can we make sure that scientists are achieving this much more modest thing. And I do get very distressed at sort of the reproducibility crisis, especially as an outsider who has very little technical expertise in the sort of matters of statistical insufficiency and underpowered things, and you know when is it okay to get rid of outliers and when should you keep them in? I mean, these are things that I have no idea how to do, and I have to trust that other people are doing them. But I also hear reports constantly of that certain experiment X is not reproducible, of blatant fraud, of poor training, that led to confounding results, to not sufficient controls, to a complete lack of control. So I'm finding it hard to trust that even in this much more modest thing of producing this bit of knowledge is not happening because the quality of science and scientific integrity is not high enough. And part of that might actually be that it's not valued enough because we're setting our sights too high on this much more abstract goal rather than what can we do today to make sure this happens.
So I think the reproducibility crisis, there's another panel about the reproducibility crisis. I think the reproducibility crisis is not something that we should be that concerned about. And the reason is that the reproducibility crisis reflects the fact that science is a self-correcting enterprise. As I said several times, scientists are imperfect. Now, the processes of review and so on and so forth that are supposed to lead us to get funding for our work are supposed to weed out the poorly designed experiments, the inadequate controls, all of those things. I can't pretend that some of them don't happen. But the point is that irreproducible results are not going to stand. They're not going to survive. The scientific enterprise will find them and it will correct them. And so, although it may seem, and indeed it is, an imperfection of a sort from the outside, it's actually something that science takes care of in-house. And I think the history of science says that we do a pretty good job of that.
This might sound off topic, but I think underneath it relates, and it's addressed to Tony. If you had some sane people approach you, and because they were so devoted to scientific progress, they wanted to volunteer to have holes drilled in their skull or to ingest toxins for your research program, would you accept them?
No.
Would you say briefly why?
Because I believe that, so first of all, I mean, in a less sort of exaggerated framework, there's a notion of informed consent. People in medical research can indeed volunteer to undertake certain procedures that are part of medical research enterprises. And if I were a physician and I did clinical research on humans, I might have populations of people who agree to some kinds of research. But the procedures you're describing, okay, are without therapeutic benefit and without any benefit to the individual. And the criteria that Jeff articulated earlier that we apply to human research make those, in my view, unethical.
They would have the they would get the benefit of the satisfaction that they were contributing. And I'm not talking about procedures that kill them, which, like the monkeys with holes in the years.
Yeah, I still think that the ability of a walk-in individual to offer me that judgment is something that I would question. I mean, I had a colleague who was one of the early discoverers of the effects of stimulating parts of the cerebral cortex and modifying the way that animals appear to perceive things. And it's kind of an interesting philosophical question. It's an abstract Ouija type experiment when you stimulate the brain. And he often speculates, I've heard him speculate in talks about the possibility of having his own brain stimulated to find out what the monkeys were actually experiencing. But he hasn't done it, and nobody would do it with him or for him, I think. And I'm certainly no responsible colleague. And it's because, I guess, in my view of graded moral status, humans are graded apart from animals. So you make the point that I would do things to an animal without its permission that I would not do to a human with its permission, then I'll stand by it.
I'm not advocating.
No, it's an absolutely fair question, and it puts me on the spot of making exactly that statement. And I'm not sure that Jeff would make the same statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I appreciate your candor about that, because I think that is a noteworthy difference. In this case, really, the question is asking, would you allow this to be done to a willing human participant? And the answer is no. And as you noted, the main difference, of course, is that the human is capable of informed consent and the non-human is not. Now, ordinarily, and also the non-human is the non-human, which I deny is relevant, is relevant. Ordinarily, if you have two individuals who are candidates for a particular experiment, which is harmful and invasive, and one of them is capable of informed consent and providing that informed consent for whatever reason, and the other is incapable of informed consent, we would ordinarily think that more protections are needed for the latter individual, not for the former individual, except in this case because of the moral relevance of species membership. So a lot comes down to the moral relevance of species membership, which is, of course, a separate moral and political discussion, which I would love to have more of. But I really do think that question is illuminating because it sheds light on this what I see as a tension in the way that we think about this. Even if we accept a scalar, again, account of moral standing, I think we really kind of have to put our thumb on the scales in order to make it the case that the cost-benefit analysis comes out in favor of more risks for the incapable of consent than for the capable of consent.
It's not a scalar if you put your thumb on the scale.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Sure. So the cost-benefit analysis, or more formally in ethics, the two-factor egalitarianism, for example, it seems like a useful tool when the human benefit is quite obvious, like in the case of deep brain stimulation or maybe development of HIV medications or something like this. I'm just wondering how you can sort of extend the calculus to include cases where knowledge for knowledge's sake. There seems like a gradation between that or kinds of experiments that might have some like future benefit or further understanding that might lead to some other kind of better understanding. So, just what's the sort of strategy for sort of evaluating the quality of knowledge? That becomes a little more abstract with a less clear societal benefit.
So Carolyn and I are laughing because we are currently debating this in an issue of Cambridge Quarterly. So basically, very, very briefly, David DeGrazia and I have argued that at a bare minimum, in order to justify the types of experiments that we've been discussing, harmful, invasive, non-consensual, non-therapeutic, et cetera, non-human subjects research, you should be able to show certain things about it, that you provide animals with a life minimally worth living and have their basic needs met, et cetera, and that you can show some sort of benefit that could arise from this study. There should be some expected social benefit for humans or non-humans needs that could arise from this study. And then Carolyn and co-authors, so do you
I
want
kind of push back on the
Yeah.
expectation of social benefit, in part motivated by my response to over here about knowledge for knowledge's sake is important and can be valuable regardless of its applications. And because I worry about this distraction thing, right? That we can really carefully assess using the sort of scientific methods that I don't understand, whether or not that knowledge will be produced in this particular experiment, whether or not you can actually make good on learning the thing that you set out to learn. And I think too often there's in sort of where we put our thumb, it's more on what are the societal benefits, how is this going to help us in the long run, and not enough emphasis on can you make good on what you promised to learn in this one experiment. And so I'm actually happy to say that knowledge for knowledge's sake is valuable and can factor.
In all cases, there's no.
This is tricky. There are lots of marginal cases. I mean,
this is where we go, and you know we don't have to play out the whole conversation right now, but we come back to this tension as a thread in our conversation today, where again the sort of tension is that on one hand, if you say that the standard has to be that you show some further social benefit that you can expect, then that is an unreasonable epistemic burden because of the way that science works and what you can realistically ask a scientist to reliably predict about the outcome of their study. But on the other hand, if you say, well, in light of that, we're going to lower the bar, so all you need to do is show that your study is going to produce knowledge of one kind or another without any indication of whether that could plausibly lead to some further societal benefit, then the doors just go wide open, and now you haven't really established a standard that meaningfully restricts research at all. And again, in the human case, we would recognize that that is not an appropriately high standard. And I think we just are appreciating that this is a really difficult tension to resolve because both kind of appear to be non-starters, and then it's difficult to find a middle ground.
it's worth noting that other conditions do a lot of the moral work. So we can have this disagreement and still agree that non-therapeutic invasive research is wrong for other reasons. And it has nothing to do with the knowledge or the benefits expected, but because you're harming a creature whose bulk will be significantly worse because of involvement in this experiment, whether that's through genetic modification or yes, or any other intervention. So again, I don't know that everything rides on this one distinction because of the other conditions of ethical animal use, but it is one that I think is somewhat, it remains a huge tension in this area.
I do want to just weigh in briefly. I mean, so the idea that anything goes if you don't apply some sort of bar, I think again neglects the fact that there are a whole series of hurdles that scientists have to cross before they can actually do an experiment. So, I mean, in the 19th century era of British gentlemen scholars who would go into their labs in Oxford and Cambridge and spend their own wealth doing whatever they felt like doing, well, those times are gone. And so we do have to satisfy both regulatory and funding agencies that what we're doing is not completely, lunatic, and it has some foundation. Now, whether that provides enough of a bar to satisfy either of you or both of you is an open question, but it's not quite anything goes.
Yeah,
Tim is implying.
I'm happy to acknowledge that anything goes as an exaggeration. Yeah. I would more carefully say where the hell too much goes, but definitely not everything goes.
And I don't think anybody here would argue that not enough goes, because I think all of those protections are apt, if only, and I come back to the fact that we owe the people who pay for our research an explanation of what it is that we are learning with their knowledge. And that's, and that, in my view, I mean, as with Carolyn, I think knowledge for knowledge's sake has many times been shown to be of unexpected value to improve the human condition. Equally, knowledge for knowledge's sake has many times in the past that we know trumpet, turned into just knowledge. Right? But there is something about the corpus of human knowledge and the fact that we as scientists have done something which is in some sense a triumph of human culture. That means there should be a certain amount of respect for the enterprise, even if we can't predict its outcome.
100% agree about that, which is, I think, what makes this one of the most complicated issues in animal ethics. This is more than any other use of non-human animals, and this is really morally fraught, but more than any other use of non-human animals, this is the one where I think we can most plausibly point toward a vital human and non-human benefit, which is being served in a distinctive way Food, no. Entertainment, no. Other uses of non-human animals, you cannot plausibly make that case anymore. But in this case, you can plausibly make that case, and that makes it much more morally complicated. And I really do appreciate all of the benefits that this kind of research has produced.
And again, I'll just comment that I see progress is moving towards, in fact, less and less invasive methods, use of nanotechnology, telemetry, microimplantation, remote imaging, awake imaging, having a monkey go into an MRI imager and sit there and get image while it's awake. I mean, these are all things that we're doing now. And I see a future where the invasive probing becomes unnecessary and we get the information we need. And this is all due to the fact that everything builds on what came before it. And so, I mean, again, you can have an ethical debate on whether that was something that should have been done. But the fact is, it's progressing to a point where there's less and less invasive work.
In 40 years, this panel is going to be debating the rights of digital beings.
That's cyborg technology.
Yeah,
That's
no,
correct.
I'm not going to deep
Nets.
that.
We're all gonna be deep nets by then.
Thank you guys so much. I just want to thank each and every one of you in return the thanks that you gave me in your opening remarks. I'm really grateful that we could have this discussion in the public forum. I'm really grateful for you guys for turning up to this event. I think it's a really interesting conversation that we can continue to have after this event as well. So without further ado, thank you.
Thank you.
And we actually have